On the night of June 22nd, 1987, 16-year-old Kari Lynn Nixon left a local store in Au Forks, New York, for what should have been a short walk home. The streets were quiet, the neighborhood familiar, and yet she never arrived. For years, the town and her family searched in vain, hoping for answers that did not come. How could a young girl vanish so completely in a place she had known all her life, leaving only unanswered questions behind? In the small town of Au Forks, New York, began like any other summer evening. The community was quiet, familiar, and close-knit, where neighbors knew one another's routines, and children often walked short distances alone. Kari Lynn Nixon, a 16-year-old high school student, had gone to a nearby store to pick up some items. The walk home was brief, a path she had taken many times before, and there were no signs that anyone was following or watching. The streets were calm, the houses lit softly, and the air carried the usual warmth of a northern Adirondack summer. As the evening progressed, Kari Lynn did not return home. Her absence was noticed by her family when it became clear that she had not come back at her usual pace. At first, they thought she might have been delayed, lingering at a friend's house or stopping for errands. However, as minutes passed, concern began to grow. By the time they realized she had not returned for hours, the situation had shifted from ordinary to alarming. The absence of any communication, the silence along the streets, and the lack of activity at the stores she might have visited created a growing sense of unease. Her parents quickly checked the familiar routes she usually walked, calling out her name through the quiet neighborhood. They contacted neighbors, friends, and relatives, asking if anyone had seen her since she left the store. Each no answered only heightened the tension. It was the type of fear that grows quietly but persistently, as parents begin to imagine the many possibilities, all of them unsettling, that could explain a child not returning home. While the community had always felt safe, the sudden absence of Kari Lynn introduced a sense of vulnerability and uncertainty that was rare in a town so small. By nightfall, the family reported her missing to the local authorities. The initial call was calm, measured, but carried with it an undercurrent of urgency. Officers were dispatched quickly, understanding the importance of the first hours in any case involving a young person. They began retracing the route she would have taken, speaking to anyone who might have been outside at the time, and checking locations she was known to frequent. Even in a town where everyone knew each other, a single unexplained absence could ripple through the community, affecting residents' sense of safety and prompting immediate action. As word spread, neighbors began to assist in the search, walking the streets, shining flashlights into alleys, and calling out her name. Though they remained hopeful, each passing hour without a sighting or a clue intensified the concern. Parents guided their own children indoors, watching carefully for any unexpected movements, and local shopkeepers looked at the closed streets with a heightened awareness. The town that had felt secure only hours earlier was now filled with a quiet tension, the kind that comes when an entire community recognizes the possibility that something is not right, though the exact cause is unknown. Throughout the night, the initial responders coordinated their search with care. Every possible route, every alleyway, and each public space was methodically checked. Officers noted the importance of timing, understanding that any delay could reduce the chances of finding her quickly. Volunteers moved with purpose, but also with caution, knowing that in situations involving missing teenagers, small clues could be easily overlooked. The streets and open spaces were combed carefully, with officers and neighbors alike calling her name at intervals, listening for any sound that might indicate her presence. Despite the careful planning, no sign of Kari Lynn was found that night. Her disappearance introduced a series of questions that could not yet be answered. Where had she gone? Was she simply delayed? Or had something occurred during the short walk from the store to her home? Each unanswered question added to the tension, shaping the strategy of the search teams and the anxiety of her family. Even as authorities and neighbors continued their efforts, the absence of evidence created a space for worry to grow, and the unknown seemed larger than the familiar streets of the town. By the early hours of the following morning, the reality of her disappearance settled over Sable Forks. The town, usually quiet and predictable, had been transformed. Streets that had been familiar now carried uncertainty, and residents remained vigilant. The first hours of a disappearance are critical, and in those moments, the small details, the time she left, the route she might have taken, the people she might have passed, became the foundation for what would develop into an extensive search. As the sun began to rise over the northern Adirondacks, the urgency of the situation was unmistakable. A 16-year-old girl was missing. The community had mobilized, and the next steps would be crucial in determining what had happened during the night she vanished. By the morning following Carrie Lynn Nixon's disappearance, the town of Sable Forks had shifted from a quiet summer community to a place gripped by worry and focused activity. Local authorities coordinated with volunteers to begin a structured search, moving methodically through the streets, nearby wooded areas, and public spaces. Every familiar route the girl might have taken was retraced, while residents scanned the neighborhood for anything unusual: footprints, discarded items, or signs of movement. Despite the calm appearance of the town, the atmosphere was charged with tension as every passerby and resident wondered what could have happened during the hours when Carrie Lynn vanished. Authorities set up a command post near the center of town to organize the search teams. Officers divided the area into sectors, assigning groups of volunteers and local officials to each zone. Some focused on the streets and alleys closest to the stores and homes she had passed. Others combed the wooded areas at the edges of town, searching for hidden paths, small clearings, or signs of recent human activity. The planning was meticulous. Teams communicated through radios, recorded each area they had checked, and coordinated rotations to cover as much ground as possible before fatigue set in. The town's residents responded immediately. Neighbors formed walking parties, shining flashlights into yards and calling out her name. Parents held their children close, wary of the unknown, while others reviewed security measures in their homes, worried that a simple lapse could put someone else at risk. The disappearance of a teenager, seemingly within minutes and in a familiar area, created a ripple effect. Adults who had taken the safety of their streets for granted were now acutely aware of how quickly a child could move beyond notice. Volunteers and officers also conducted door-to-door inquiries, asking if anyone had seen Carrie Lynn, had heard unusual noises, or noticed suspicious activity. Though nothing concrete emerged, each report was carefully logged. Officers understood that even a minor detail, a glimpse of a vehicle, a shadow, or a brief sound, might become essential to piecing together the timeline. The sheer absence of evidence, however, created additional stress. Without confirmation of her location, the search had to remain expansive, and uncertainty became a defining element of the effort. The media attention added another layer of complexity. Local newspapers and radio broadcasts relayed updates to the broader region, and soon the story reached audiences beyond the town. Some residents welcomed the attention, believing that more eyes might increase the chances of finding her. Others feared that speculation could lead to false tips or unnecessary panic. Regardless, the community's concern deepened, as even the most routine activities, walking to the store, checking the mailbox, were now viewed with heightened caution. The search teams faced both environmental and logistical challenges. Summer heat had begun to rise, creating the risk of exhaustion among volunteers and officers. The terrain in parts of the town was uneven, with wooded patches and small creeks complicating the sweep. Teams rotated frequently to ensure vigilance remained high, and checkpoints were established to confirm that no area went unchecked. Despite these measures, each passing hour without discovery intensified the sense of urgency. The possibility that Carrie Lynn might be nearby yet, unseen, or that she had moved beyond the immediate area, created a constant pressure to cover more ground while remaining systematic. Even within the small community, speculation began to circulate. Residents worried about potential scenarios, some of which imagined unlikely but concerning outcomes. While no evidence pointed to wrongdoing by anyone in town, the unknown made every stranger, every unfamiliar sound, and every unexplained movement a potential clue. This elevated the anxiety throughout the community and reinforced the importance of careful coordination by law enforcement. By nightfall, after the first day of organized searching, the reality became clear. There were no clear leads. Every street, yard, and trail had been combed, yet Carrie Lynn remained missing. Volunteers returned home exhausted but resolute, knowing that the search would continue in the early hours of the next day. Families kept their children indoors, residents double-checked locks, and officers reviewed logs to ensure that no detail was overlooked. The sense of urgency and the fear of the unknown remained constant, shaping the way everyone moved, spoke, and observed their surroundings. In those first 24 hours, the case had already transformed the town. Streets that were once familiar and comfortable now carried the weight of uncertainty. Every passerby became a potential witness. Every unaccounted space a possible hiding place. While hope persisted that the teenager would be found quickly and safe, the lack of concrete evidence made the search feel fragile and open-ended. The community's attention, energy, and emotions would need to be sustained for days to come as the investigation moved into a critical second phase, one that would test both the resolve of the search teams and the endurance of a small town gripped by worry. After the initial flurry of activity in Osable Forks, as officers and volunteers spent their first 24 hours searching every path and yard, the investigation slowly entered a new phase, one defined by uncertainty and the long wait. The urgency of the first day had given way to a tense patience as search teams reviewed notes, checked maps, and planned the next passes. Yet for the family, each hour without news added weight to the fear, and for the community, the absence of clues fostered a quiet, pervasive unease. Carrie Lynn's parents struggled to maintain their routines, though every ordinary task reminded them of her absence. Meals were taken in silence, conversations were brief, and every knock at the door or passing vehicle was met with a moment of apprehension. Friends and extended family attempted to provide comfort, but even their presence could not erase the persistent worry that had taken root. Each passing hour without discovery felt like a reminder of what might have happened, leaving the family caught between hope and dread. The local authorities continued to coordinate searches, but the lack of physical evidence slowed progress. Investigators revisited statements, canvassed residents again, and reviewed any possible leads, but each inquiry yielded only partial or inconclusive information. Officers were careful not to speculate publicly, emphasizing instead the need for continued vigilance and methodical investigation. Still, the community's collective imagination filled the gaps left by the absence of evidence. Speculation circulated quietly. Could she have wandered further than expected? Had someone in the area seen her? Every unanswered question deepened the sense that the town's safety had been disrupted in a way it had rarely experienced. The media attention, while providing wider awareness, also intensified the pressure on families and search teams. Reports described the missing teenager, her last known location, and the ongoing efforts, bringing outside scrutiny to a small, otherwise private community. Local residents found themselves answering questions from journalists while continuing their own searches or tending to daily responsibilities. For some, the presence of cameras and reporters was a reassurance. For others, it was a reminder of the magnitude of the situation. Either way, it emphasized that the absence of the teenager had become not just a personal concern, but a community matter. Volunteers continued their efforts, moving in smaller groups along streets and through wooded areas, calling her name and checking places previously passed over. Canine units were used to try to pick up a trail, though with limited success. The subtlety of time, the shifting of weather conditions, and the vast area to cover made the task increasingly difficult. Each new attempt reinforced a quiet but persistent lesson. The disappearance of a young person often defies easy explanation, even when familiar surroundings are involved. Within the command post, investigators began evaluating the possible timelines and potential scenarios. Without concrete evidence, each theory required careful documentation rather than immediate action. They considered every angle: natural deviations from a known path, temporary concealment, accidental delays, or brief interactions with individuals who may have been unaware of the child's situation. None of these possibilities could be confirmed, but all were carefully recorded to ensure that no lead would be overlooked. Meanwhile, the town's residents lived under a shared tension. Parents kept their own children close, checking doors and windows more frequently, while others reflected on what measures could have prevented the disappearance. Conversations among neighbors were subdued, measured, and often revolved around cautionary advice rather than conjecture. The fear that had gripped the community in the first day did not vanish. It simply evolved into a constant, quiet awareness that the situation remained unresolved. By the end of the second day, fatigue, frustration, and concern had settled over both the search teams and the family. The lack of new information transformed urgency into careful persistence. Investigators planned the next steps: renewed canvassing, additional interviews, and a more detailed review of potential hiding spots. Volunteers prepared for extended shifts. The town, meanwhile, maintained a sense of alertness, as every sound or movement could have provided the breakthrough that had remained elusive for 48 hours. In this period, the case became an enduring presence in the minds of those involved. It was no longer just a search. It was a prolonged state of uncertainty, shaping the behavior of individuals, the allocation of resources, and the perception of safety within the community. The quiet spread of anxiety, the methodical repetition of searches, and the slow accumulation of small details formed a pattern characteristic of many long unsolved disappearances. Time stretches, hope and fear intertwine, and every next step becomes both critical and tentative. By the close of the second day, the town had accepted that the search could extend further. The family, authorities, and neighbors remained vigilant, aware that each hour, though unproductive in results, carried the potential for discovery. The situation had moved from immediate crisis to a prolonged wait, where anticipation, concern, and preparation would sustain the effort until a new development occurred. Years had passed since Kari Lynn Nixon had disappeared from the quiet streets of Ausable Forks. The town remained aware of the unresolved case, and the memory of her absence lingered, affecting families, local officials, and anyone involved in the initial search. Over time, the intensity of the immediate search faded, though the investigation never truly stopped. Authorities maintained records, monitored potential leads, and periodically revisited any reports that could provide new insights, even as the case seemed to grow colder with each passing year. The turning point came unexpectedly, while Robert Anthony Jones, the man later identified as the suspect, was in custody for unrelated federal charges. Jones, already serving time for previous offenses, was approached by investigators to discuss historical cases. During these discussions, he offered information that directed authorities to a location on his father's property in the town of Jay, Essex County. The specificity of the details he provided prompted immediate verification. Troopers and forensic specialists traveled to the site, careful to document every step. The area described was remote, partially wooded, and included a small, secluded cabin long associated with the suspect's family. Upon arriving at the designated location, officers began a systematic examination of the terrain. Using metal probes, shovels, and careful observation, they located a shallow depression consistent with a recently disturbed area of soil. Protective measures were taken to preserve any potential evidence. After careful excavation, remains were discovered. While the passage of time had altered the condition of the site, forensic procedures allowed the team to identify the remains as those of Carrie Lynn Nixon. The proximity to the cabin aligned with the timeline reconstructed from witness statements and the suspect's own account. The discovery immediately shifted the investigation from a missing person case to one involving confirmed homicide. State troopers and federal agents coordinated to secure the scene, preserve evidence, and gather the suspect for further questioning. Every aspect of the location, including nearby objects, soil disturbance, and potential traces of human activity, was meticulously documented. Photographs, notes, and sketches were taken to ensure the integrity of the evidence. Forensic specialists began their analysis, examining the remains, nearby vegetation, and soil composition to establish the likely sequence of events. Jones provided further details under supervision, explaining the sequence in which the disappearance occurred, the location of the cabin, and the steps that had led to the concealment of the remains. His cooperation allowed investigators to corroborate elements of the initial search and identify inconsistencies in prior reports. It also provided sufficient information to bring formal charges for kidnapping, assault, and homicide. While the precise forensic determination of cause of death would be confirmed through medical examination, the combination of his statements and the location of the remains established the central facts of the case. The revelation had an immediate impact on the community. Families and neighbors who had lived with uncertainty for years received confirmation of Carrie Lynn's fate. While the news was difficult to absorb, it provided a concrete answer to a question that had remained unanswered for 7 years. Investigators emphasized the importance of this step. The discovery allowed law enforcement to close certain aspects of the case, bring charges against the responsible party, and focus on ensuring that justice could proceed through the legal system. At the same time, authorities recognized that even with this breakthrough, many questions remained. The process of recovery and documentation opened new avenues for understanding how the disappearance had gone undetected for such a long period. Details about the suspect's prior activities, his location during the initial investigation, and the lack of physical evidence at the time were reviewed carefully. Each factor contributed to the broader understanding of why the search in the early hours and subsequent years had not yielded results. For the family, the discovery brought both closure and continued emotional processing. While the presence of evidence confirmed what had long been feared, it also allowed for the initiation of legal proceedings and provided clarity after years of uncertainty. Counselors and support groups became involved to help navigate the complex emotions associated with learning the truth after such a prolonged period. The focus shifted to the next steps, ensuring that the legal system would address the events fully and that the memory of Carrie Lynn could be preserved respectfully. By the end of the day, the discovery of the remains had transformed the case from a cold file into an active legal investigation. Authorities prepared formal charges, reviewed all supporting evidence, and coordinated with federal and local offices to maintain procedural accuracy. The community, though still affected by the knowledge of the tragic outcome, could finally begin to process the events with the understanding that the central mystery, where Carrie Lynn had been resolved. While the emotional journey was far from complete, law enforcement could proceed confidently, armed with evidence and statements that would support a formal prosecution. After the discovery of Carrie Lynn Nixon's remains, law enforcement shifted into a structured and thorough phase of investigation aimed at establishing a clear legal path for prosecution. State troopers, federal agents, and forensic experts coordinated to ensure that all details surrounding the disappearance and the subsequent concealment of evidence were accurately documented. The objective was to connect the suspect, Robert Anthony Jones, to the events with sufficient proof to sustain formal charges while maintaining procedural rigor that would hold up in court. Investigators began by reconstructing the timeline of the night Carrie Lynn vanished. Using statements from neighbors, prior witness reports, and Jones's own cooperation, officers pieced together the sequence from the moment she left the store until her disappearance. Although 7 years had passed, the suspect provided guidance that allowed officers to narrow the location of the cabin on his father's property and understand how the remains had been concealed. Each step was carefully noted, and forensic teams recorded soil disturbances, footprints, and other environmental clues to support the narrative. Parallel to the physical investigation, authorities conducted interviews and background checks related to the suspect. Jones had previously served time for bank-related offenses, including multiple robberies in New York and Maine. His criminal record, while unrelated to the disappearance, provided context for law enforcement regarding his behavior and patterns of decision-making. Additionally, investigators looked into his personal history, connections, and any previous interactions with law enforcement that could help corroborate timelines or explain opportunities he may have had to commit the crime. The forensic review of the site where the remains were found was meticulous. Specialists documented the exact position of the burial, examined soil composition, and collected samples to validate the approximate time of interment. Evidence from nearby vegetation and physical impressions in the soil were also collected. These details would be essential for the prosecution to demonstrate both the location of the crime and the suspect's presence at the time. Forensic analysis extended to clothing remnants and any trace materials that might remain after 7 years, ensuring that even minor findings were preserved for examination. In parallel, investigators reviewed prior leads from the original 1987 disappearance. This included notes from troopers, volunteers, and community members. They re-evaluated any inconsistencies or gaps in the early search to understand why Carrie Lynn had remained undiscovered for so long. The analysis highlighted a combination of factors: the remote location of the burial, the absence of witnesses, and the procedural limitations of the initial search, which had focused on more accessible areas and relied on immediate visible clues. Understanding these gaps helped law enforcement anticipate potential defense arguments and prepare for the scrutiny of court proceedings. Once the physical and procedural evidence was consolidated, the focus shifted to legal documentation and preparation for formal charges. Based on the investigation, Jones faced multiple counts, including first-degree kidnapping, assault, and second-degree murder. Prosecutors worked closely with law enforcement to ensure that all evidence was admissible, that witness statements were verified, and that timelines were logically coherent. Each document, photograph, and note from the site was cross-referenced with previous reports to maintain consistency and integrity. The suspect's cooperation was a critical component in this phase. Jones led officers to the exact location of the remains, confirming details that might otherwise have been difficult to establish due to the passage of time. His statements were recorded and verified against physical evidence, creating a direct link between the suspect and the location of the crime. This cooperation not only accelerated the legal process, but also eliminated other potential suspects, including those who had been considered in the early stages of the investigation. Throughout this process, authorities maintained communication with the family of Carrie Lynn. Updates were provided on the progress of the investigation, the collection of evidence, and the upcoming legal steps. While the emotional impact of 7 years of uncertainty could not be erased, having clarity on the suspect, the location of the remains, and the procedural handling of the case provided some measure of reassurance. The family could finally begin to understand the circumstances surrounding her disappearance and the steps being taken toward justice. By the end of this phase, law enforcement had compiled a comprehensive case file containing all investigative details, forensic reports, suspect statements, and corroborating evidence. The documentation provided a solid foundation for prosecutorial review and set the stage for the next step in the judicial process. Investigators recognized that the procedural accuracy, attention to detail, and methodical preservation of evidence would be crucial to achieving accountability and ensuring that the outcome reflected the severity and resolution of a case unresolved for 7 years. Following the discovery of Carrie Lynn Nixon's remains and the thorough investigation led by state and federal authorities, the case transitioned fully into the legal system. Prosecutors in Essex County prepared formal charges against Robert Anthony Jones, including first-degree kidnapping, assault, and second-degree homicide. Each count was carefully structured to reflect both the historical timeline of events and the evidence collected from the site, the suspect's statements, and corroborating documentation from the original disappearance. The passage of 7 years had created challenges in gathering witnesses and verifying early reports, but the physical evidence and the suspect's cooperation provided a foundation strong enough to proceed to a grand jury. Jones, already serving time in federal custody for previous convictions, faced the county's legal process under close supervision. Investigators and legal counsel meticulously reviewed each element of the case to ensure procedural correctness, anticipating questions about the delay between the disappearance and discovery. The defense had limited room to argue alternate scenarios, as the suspect had voluntarily led authorities to the burial site and confirmed details about the events of June 22, 1987. This cooperation effectively eliminated other potential suspects and allowed the prosecution to present a coherent narrative grounded in both factual evidence and the suspect's testimony. During pre-trial hearings, the court examined the admissibility of all collected evidence, including forensic reports, excavation documentation, and historical investigative notes. Experts testified regarding the location and condition of the remains, providing context for the timeline and affirming the connection to the suspect. Additional expert testimony clarified how the environmental and procedural factors over 7 years could have influenced the preservation of the site and the delayed discovery. Legal scrutiny extended to the suspect's prior criminal record, though only insofar as it provided context for patterns of behavior and opportunity, without allowing unrelated offenses to bias the case. The grand jury proceedings were focused on establishing probable cause for the formal indictment. Prosecutors emphasized the suspect's role in leading authorities to the burial site, the correlation between his statements and physical evidence, and the thoroughness of the investigative process. They presented a timeline that traced Carrie Lynn's last known movements from the moment she left the store to the concealment of her remains on the property. Through witness statements, environmental documentation, and the suspect's detailed account, the grand jury evaluated whether the legal threshold for formal charges had been met. By the conclusion of this stage, the grand jury returned indictments for first-degree kidnapping, assault, and second-degree homicide. The decision reflected a recognition that, although years had passed, the evidence demonstrated a clear chain of events implicating Jones in both the disappearance and the subsequent death. Legal professionals noted that the case illustrated the complexities of long unsolved missing person incidents, the passage of time, challenges in evidence preservation, and the necessity of suspect cooperation to bring resolution. Parallel to the formal charges in Essex County, the federal sentence Jones was already serving for previous robberies remained in effect. Coordination between state and federal authorities ensured that his incarceration continued uninterrupted, while also allowing the state proceedings to proceed without conflict. This dual-track management of the case highlighted the procedural intricacies involved when a suspect has existing legal obligations in separate jurisdictions. Throughout the process, law enforcement and prosecutors maintained communication with Carrie Lynn's family. They were informed of each step: indictment, hearings, and preparations for trial. While the emotional weight of 7 years could not be removed, the family gained clarity on the course of justice and the legal mechanisms being employed. They understood that the formal charges represented an acknowledgement of the events, a confirmation of accountability, and an avenue through which they could seek closure within the bounds of the judicial system. Even with formal indictments and clear evidence, some aspects of the case remained uncertain due to the elapsed time. The precise details of Carrie Lynn's movements during the brief period between leaving the store and the concealment of her remains could not be fully reconstructed. These gaps were addressed in court as contextual factors rather than as limitations of the prosecution's case. Legal experts noted that such uncertainties are common in long-delayed investigations, where forensic evidence and witness memory degrade over time. Nonetheless, the combination of physical evidence, forensic documentation, and the suspect's own cooperation created a coherent and compelling framework for prosecution. By the end of this phase, the case had transitioned from decades of uncertainty into a structured legal proceeding. Charges had been filed, the suspect was clearly identified, and the evidence trail was documented to meet legal standards. For the community and the family, the focus shifted from speculation and unanswered questions to the procedural steps necessary to ensure justice. While some questions about the circumstances of the disappearance could never be answered completely, the legal process provided a concrete path forward, transforming a long unsolved mystery into a case that could be addressed and adjudicated within the justice system. The outcome highlighted several lessons: the importance of persistent investigation, the role of suspect cooperation in resolving long-standing cases, and the capacity of the legal system to handle complex, delayed incidents with rigor and fairness. The case also left open a reflective question for observers. In situations where significant time passes, how much can procedural diligence compensate for the absence of early evidence? And how can families and communities continue to find closure even when some details remain unknown? The confirmation of Carrie Lynn Nixon's remains after 7 years brought a mix of emotions for her family. Relief, in the sense that the uncertainty that had haunted them for so long was finally resolved, was intertwined with grief over the knowledge of what had occurred. Her father, Gary Nixon, expressed a sentiment that reflected both sorrow and determination. He hoped the legal system would ensure that the responsible party would face consequences for the events that had taken place. Even in this moment of resolution, the family's thoughts returned to the years of waiting, the unanswered questions, and the experiences that had defined their lives since the disappearance. For the family, the discovery allowed them to process events in a structured way. They were able to work with law enforcement to understand the sequence of the crime, the location of the remains, and the steps being taken toward formal charges. While the emotional weight of the loss could not be erased, Having clarity about the circumstances allowed them to begin a journey toward closure. It also provided a sense of certainty in a situation that had, for 7 years, been dominated by speculation, fear, and frustration. Each piece of information offered by investigators helped to anchor their understanding and provided a framework for their grief. The broader community of Au Sable Forks and surrounding areas experienced a complex set of responses. Residents who had participated in initial searches or had been involved in volunteer efforts years earlier reflected on the case and its resolution. The knowledge that the perpetrator had been located and the remains recovered gave a measure of reassurance, demonstrating that persistent investigation and procedural diligence could eventually yield answers, even in cases long considered cold. At the same time, the community was reminded of the fragility of safety and the importance of vigilance, particularly in small towns where everyone assumes a baseline level of security. The legal developments, including formal charges and preparation for trial, provided an additional form of closure. While the trial process would take time, the clear identification of the suspect, the evidence linking him to the crime, and the formal legal mechanisms being pursued offered a structured path for accountability. The family's engagement with this process allowed them to participate in decisions that could shape the outcome, to ask questions, and to understand how the evidence was being evaluated. Each step of the legal proceedings reinforced the sense that justice was being addressed through methodical, lawful procedures rather than conjecture or rumor. As the case entered its legal phase, the family and the community also began to consider the broader implications of the disappearance. Discussions about safety measures, community vigilance, and the support of families in similar circumstances became part of the local dialogue. Law enforcement officers emphasized the importance of accurate record-keeping, procedural thoroughness, and cooperation between local and federal authorities in handling complex or prolonged cases. These conversations highlighted the lessons that could be drawn from a case in which an initial disappearance remained unresolved for several years before the truth emerged. For the family, the human dimension of the case remained central. The years of uncertainty, the efforts to search, the community support, and finally the discovery of the remains had created a narrative that went beyond legal definitions. It was a story about waiting, endurance, and the profound effects of unresolved loss. Parents, siblings, and relatives were forced to navigate a range of emotions, balancing relief with grief, and processing information in a way that respected both the memory of Carrie Lynn and the factual details of the case. Counselors and support services were engaged to provide guidance, ensuring that the family could address their emotional needs while participating in the legal proceedings. The case also served as a broader reminder to communities about the complexities involved in missing person investigations. Even in a small, close-knit town, a disappearance can create far-reaching consequences, shaping perceptions of safety, affecting everyday routines, and prompting reflection on how individuals and organizations respond to emergencies. The persistence of law enforcement and the eventual cooperation of the suspect demonstrated that, while answers may be delayed, systematic investigation, careful documentation, and the collaboration of multiple agencies can eventually yield results. By the time legal proceedings were underway, the family could focus on remembering their daughter with clarity rather than uncertainty. Personal items, photographs, and memories became central in the mourning process, offering tangible connections to the life that had been lost. The community, too, maintained awareness, recognizing the case as an example of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and long-term commitment to unresolved investigations. While questions about exact details of the disappearance remained, the family could find solace in the knowledge that the events were documented, the responsible party identified, and a legal process in motion. The lasting impact of the case extended beyond closure and accountability. It was a lesson in the persistence required to solve long-standing mysteries, the patience needed by families enduring years of uncertainty, and the capacity of communities and law enforcement to work together in pursuit of truth. For the Nixon family, the return of clarity offered the opportunity to honor Carrie Lynn's memory with dignity and to participate in the judicial process with awareness and agency. For observers and other families, the story reinforced that even after years, a combination of investigation, legal diligence, and community support can bring answers that had once seemed unattainable. The final reflection is both simple and profound. Enduring uncertainty over years is a burden few families should carry alone. Yet with coordinated effort and careful investigation, the truth can eventually be uncovered. The case of Carrie Lynn Nixon stands as a testament to the importance of persistence, methodical inquiry, and the human resilience required to confront and endure unresolved loss. Even in the shadow of tragedy, the pursuit of clarity, justice, and recognition of the human story remains essential. What do you think happened during those 7 years before Carrie Lynn Nixon was found? Share your thoughts and tell us, where did you first hear about this story? Your perspective helps others understand the challenges of long unsolved cases and the persistence required to find the truth.